thank you so much for joining us today on our panel about the future of digital identity. I am Sofia Ayalde, co-founder of EagleCheck.
Hi everyone, I'm Audrey, and I'm also the co-founder of EagleCheck. So today we're having three amazing speakers with us. First, Andrew Darley, blockchain leader of IBM from the UK.
Second, David Rennie, digital identity specialist at IDEMIA, also from the UK.
And Jason Bennick, the co-founder and senior managing director of Product Labb from the USA. Welcome to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Sofia. Pleasure to meet both you gentlemen.
Nice to meet you all too.
So this panel aims to be an insightful discussion on the state of digital identity, the benefits it has, and its potential in the future. We would like this session to be interactive between all speakers to listen to different points of view from different organizations and different markets.
Okay, so before we begin the conversation, we would like to clarify what we consider to be digital identity, because this term can often be confused when it is being discussed. So what we consider digital identity is every aspect of an individual's life that can be claimed and recorded in a digital manner or in the cyberspace. So for example, it can be a university diploma or your social security number, your passport, any important career accomplishment even, and so on. So is there anything any one of you would like to add to this definition?
I would describe a digital identity as a reusable mechanism that allows a person to be recognized by another person through a digital communication or a digital transaction. So that might be very minimalistic in the information that's provided, and in different contexts and different transactions, there will be different ways in which people are recognized. But what we aspire to, I think what the digital world aspires to, is a method that is acceptable in different contexts, so that I don't have to continually reprove who I am in each interaction that I have.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that as well. And we're actually working on that at EagleCheck. So it's very nice that you mentioned it. So, okay, now that that has been said, and thank you, let's jump into our first topic. So our first question is, what do you consider the benefits of having a verified digital identity, both for individual enterprises and other institutions?
I'll just contribute a little bit of information to this from my perspective. I think I'll just step back up and start off with just a very small, quick story. I was speaking to a colleague of mine, and he said something that kind of summed up all of this in one statement, which is, he said, it really addressed this topic, I guess, the business and technology of digital identification, which is that if digital identity was simple, then we wouldn't have so many solutions for it. And I think pondering the subject or the topic of digital identity, there's so many permutations attached to it that before a discussion of benefits are in order, I think it's important to really understand the technology that surrounds it and why does it even exist. We have today our driver's license, our passports, our different identities and credit cards. But the issue with that is you're talking about a material conveyance of identification pairing with an actual human that allows others to recognize the provenance of that individual. And so, as you know, David was just saying, you don't want to have to constantly, with a digital identity, be producing and verification of who you are each and every transaction in life, whether it's, passing through an airport or whether it is buying something online. You have to be able to have really a stable point of reference. And so I think the greatest benefit of a digital identity gives you really a sovereignty to your existence. And that sovereignty can be really coexisted in an environment, both now and in the future, as long as you have some sort of decentralized identifier or a DID that allows you to coexist. And I think the digital identity process transitions from like the Industrial Revolution or analog to digital. We're going from a material form of existence and verification to a method in an electronic form. And right now that transition is at such a nascent stage of existence right now. There's just hundreds, if not, thousands of means of doing so. And they all lack that ability to provide that sovereignty in a secure fashion. So I think the biggest benefit of digital identity is displacing the prior methods of coexistence with provenance with today a means that can be done in a more efficient and valid fashion. So you're bridging from old to new, and I think digital identity gives you a means of now coexisting with how everyone's going to interact in the future. And I'm probably staying a bit too high level, but it's important to stay, at that high level to dive down in the weeds of how the technology itself works. That's what I feel the greatest benefit is, transitioning really from old to new.
And let me add a little. If you ask what the benefits are, it's almost as if you're thinking, do I have to sell digital identity? But actually, I'd turn it around and say it's absolutely essential. And yes, we don't have it yet, but we need it, and we need it yesterday. We don't need it in 3 years' time. It's absolutely essential. The modernization that's happened across IT and government is absolutely necessitating it. And however we end on a solution, and however we standardize, whether it's multi-party computation or something, really way out there, or something else, it's needed right now. So I don't think you need to sell the necessity. I think it's glaringly obvious that we need it now.
And to resonate and build on those points, I think we are transforming from an analog to a digital world. So currently we transact face to face in physical interactions, and obviously the world is moving to remote interactions, particularly in the current COVID environment, and we're recognizing the difficulties that making that step move, if you like, in necessity through the COVID crisis. We're just recognizing all of the challenges around that. So identity for me is a very minimalist thing, but a fundamentally important piece, which is, how do I control that environment to my own benefit? I have personal data out there. We are just at the beginning of understanding what the implications of the management of that personal data are, for good and for bad. And if the individual isn't at the center of that and able to control that personal data in a way that they understand and can trust, then that has fundamental implications for how we manage our lives, and how others will manipulate our paths through life. So I agree with what you were saying. This is fundamental to how we're going to engage in a digital future.
Thank you. And it is a fact that 85% of people lie on their CV or inflate their CVs. Do you think that digital identity could be a useful solution to this problem?
I definitely do. I think, if you want to say something, Andrew, on that.
No, you go first, Jason.
Yes. The answer, the short answer, yes. The longer answer is absolutely. And the reason for that is several fold. Number one, provenance of information and its validity is relied upon heavily by business today in hiring. I've been, in my career, I've hired quite a few people, and it's unfortunate, but there's only been a small percent, but sometimes that percentage of false information in credentials that are provided when someone does come in, as to their credibility or as to their attributes or past experience, bears a lot to what you put that person on project-wise within the organization. And you end up finding out sometimes a bit too late they're not at the skill level or the skill set that is required to work on a given project. I think having the information verifiable in a manner that can be accessed and by both the hiring agency or the individual, the company hiring, along with providing credibility to that person, gives them the advantage over the person that's hiring them, because then you are able to, as the prospect or as the hiree, be able to provide the access to that information, knowing that it's credible, it has not been changed, it's verifiable, and isn't really questionable. And that is difficult for someone beyond just what's on a CV. And so the CV itself or the resume itself can have content, but then the verifiability of that and where that is tied to is sometimes very difficult to access or to have to make a phone call or speak to a reference or these kind of things. So you really shorten up the process, provide verifiability through a method that's directly accessible by the person that's hiring, and it gives the certainty to all parties involved as to the provenance of the information and its validity. So that is, I think, a really critical factor in hiring. And if that could be solved unto itself is going to really streamline the hiring process. And I also want to just add one other factor on this. This is a bit of an echo back to the last thing we were discussing, which does roll into this now, which is there's around 7 or 8 billion total IoT internet connected devices that exist out there today. And it's going to be somewhere, I think, around maybe 10 billion by the end of this year. At least that's what's predicted. The engagement with those devices and the interaction between submitting, let's say, a job application or submitting, for a hire, or someone engaging the individual through that information, also has to be secure, because your guys are turning in CVs, emailing PDFs, and uploading stuff. You have no idea who really has access to this information. And then the amount of identity theft across CVs and resumes and applications is astounding. I mean, you go through LinkedIn, you see false pictures, false information. People have pulled that from other resumes, and people are saying, how did someone get that information? That was in a job application I did 2 months ago. So it's all one big bucket. It isn't just the hiring process and the CVs. It's the methodology and the conduit for which that information can be passed or transposed. So putting that in a secure blockchain and having secure identity verification and putting in both the governance and the provenance attached to how that information is accessed and passed has a lot to do with the hiring process. So I wanted to kind of throw and color that in a little bit. It's really important that all that be touched upon.
So I think you make some really good points there, and I'll just add a couple. So IBM, if I'm hiring people, like many companies, we use an external agency to sieve the CVs and make sure they go over minimum hurdles. And if you can't trust the CV, then that sieving process fails and I get the wrong people in front of me, right? So the people who are telling the truth are at a disadvantage compared to those that are lying typically, and therefore you get the wrong people in front of you, which is really frustrating and wastes a lot of time. And I'd love to fix that problem, and I think what we're talking about here can go some way to doing that. And the second thing I'd say is I don't want to spend time verifying credentials. I want it to be done in a quick and automated way that doesn't worry me, so I can get to the important thing, which is actually digging down into a person's psyche and seeing how they'd react in certain situations, right? That's where I want to spend my time, finding out how good they are in a job situation. So those are the two things that I would add.
So I guess we at IDEMIA are currently seeing a big upturn in demand around identity verification in the COVID environment for pre-employment checks. So currently in the UK, the legislation requires a face-to-face interaction for identity verification. So that typically means somebody turning up at an office with a document of some, that is reputed to be an identity document, and somebody who possibly is not an expert in document authentication looking at the document and seeing whether the photo in that document is this, has a resemblance to the person in front of them. And actually that process, the human process for doing that, is actually not very efficient. We're not actually very good at recognizing whether people look like the photographs they see in a document. Now, in the current environment, the UK government has allowed those requirements to be relaxed for a period of time, and we and some other organisations engaged in this have been engaging with the government to make a permanent change to the regulations, so that a digital technology can be used for identity verification. So, you know, like in many crises, we hope some good will come, and that we'll actually be able to improve the identity verification processes to comply with the regulations. That's actually important in a lot of circumstances. So there are a number of places of work in which you know, IDEMIA have been engaging with employers. Often you have a security environment where there has to be a degree of vetting of the person before they start work, and on many occasions there's quite a turnover of the people working in that environment. So it's quite a difficult challenge to make sure that the person who applies for the role is actually the person who turns up into work. So using technologies to make sure that the applicant links to the vetting process and then links to the person who actually arrives on site. That's something that we're seeing a great deal of interest in the current environment.
Yeah, completely. We definitely agree what you guys been saying, that the people should be able to have their identity and not having to re-verify it each time. And definitely that companies should be able to verify a person in seconds and trust this information. So due to this, I want to ask you if you believe that blockchain technology can improve the way the verified digital identities are being developed.
Yes, I can start off with that. I think so. I think the key to all this goes back to you know, encryption and authentication, and these are the key factors. And being able to provide a means of both public and private encrypted keys, or you know, that form that self-sovereign identity is what actually provides a valid form of provenance. And to me, this is really, I believe, the linchpin to solving, you know, putting in a DID or decentralized identifier process to form that self-sovereign identity, which I think is, you know, I do believe it is the primary solution across the digital identity space. I mean, you're talking about having individuals, you know, they go to some form of a self-sovereign identity platform. You sign up and you create your own DID, and now you have DIDs that can be associated with pretty much any engagement that you have, whether it's a gaming platform, whether it is, you know, having, as you mentioned earlier, a certificate hosted online and what have you. So this process of having a public and private key is to me where I feel the technology really solves the most. You have the authentication process originally is you have the public key is verifying, you know, you verify the private key that's sent the message to begin with, and then you have that paired private key, you know, is being validated, and there's a message encryption that says, oh, you are the individual that I'm communicating to. I'm validating you. I can let you access. And then, you know, a QR code pops up, and then, you know, something gets scanned, and then somebody has access to content or ends up, you know, receiving the information they're looking for. You don't have to go around and create different user IDs, different passwords, and different means and methods. That having this information now centrally stored, and now you end up having the ability of someone to come in and access that information and take away your identity. You remove that possibility entirely. And so that process of having a paired, you know, public and private key and having that DID that's created for an individual, again, we're back to encryption and authentication. And to me, that is the ticket to the technology solving, you know, provenance and solving the ability to scale anyone's access at volume, at speed, at any time, under any circumstance, because that to me is universal. And that's really what we're solving with the technology.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right, Jason. I think you've got to match technology to the right technology, and identity is fundamentally a distributed thing, right? It's a thing which should not be centralized. And, you know, we've seen many items of technology become distributed, like the internet and like IoT, but identity just hasn't followed like it should have done. It's still linked to centralized certificate authorities or other things. And, you know, in the future, in the very near future, we need to move to a technology like blockchain, which is fundamentally distributed and matches to the principles of the problem that we're trying to solve. And I agree with you about public and private keys. I do think that there are some issues around people being nervous that private keys could be stolen. There's been some high-profile instances where that's happened, namely around virtual currency, right? You know, where the stakes are very high. But there are research technologies coming along which could remove the need to have private keys, which could be quite interesting. And that providing you move to a blockchain architecture now, those technologies will be coming in not very many years to solve that problem. So again, I'm talking about multi-party computation, which is, I hope, just around the corner.
Well, IDEMIA is is an identity services company. We're fundamentally a technology company. So we operate around the world with many different types of technologies and different parts of the world. Different solutions apply. And just to be a little bit controversial, and given that IDEMIA is a technology company fundamentally, I would argue that the problem of identity is not actually a technology problem per se. I agree that blockchain is an interesting technology, and I think there are advancements in many technologies, including biometric technologies, of course, that will improve the trust environment in the digital space. I would argue, however, that the challenge of identity is much more to do with our trust framework and the way in which we trust one another and the relationships between organizations, and that is not a technology problem. That is to a large extent, it's a maturity problem, and we're seeing a lot of progress in the maturity of organizations in that environment. So for example, in Europe, the EIDAS regulation was established a few years ago, and it's a regulation a little bit like GDPR. Everybody looks at GDPR and goes, well, what does that do for us? And I think, again, with GDPR, we're at a very early stage of implementation of GDPR and indeed understanding of what it means. But these regulations are about the way in which society governs itself around data and the rights and responsibilities of individuals. And I think those are the big challenges around identity. So I would agree that blockchain is certainly a very interesting technology and creates huge potential. And I think it's got an important role to play in the future. But I don't think we should ever look to the problem being solved through a particular technology.
Yeah, definitely. Everything you're saying is super interesting. Talking about innovative technologies, what do you believe would be important to accelerate the evolution of digital identity? Do you think technology would be?
Well, as I started with the controversial line or ended with the controversial line, to me, the issue around identity is the two challenges that need to be addressed are, one, to start with the regulation and establish how digital identity aligns to the regulations. So as I mentioned, the EIDAS framework sits in splendid isolation across Europe. The EIDAS regulation has just this year been aligned to the money laundering regulation. As we know, money laundering regulations place huge costs on the financial sector. And we have now created a legislative alignment between the money laundering regulations and the EIDAS framework. Now we need to understand how we leverage that to actually drive out costs from the financial sector. The same is true for regulations around pre-employment checks, to my mind. There is, at the moment, as I was saying earlier, a respite around the requirements for employers. The legislative environment needs to be changed so that there's a clear acceptance by regulators around using digital technologies to verify people's identities. Once that happens, then you create the commercial environment in which companies like mine and yours can invest to create the solutions that align to that regulatory environment. So for me, the most important things are ensuring that we've got the right regulatory framework, ensuring that we've got the right commercial framework behind that, and ensuring that we can create the trust frameworks between organizations that allows individuals to have a much easier experience improving their identity.
I think with something like this, one of the things that can really accelerate it is a push from governments to make this happen. And I guess that follows from the regulation point. I would say that whilst not naming names, I am seeing all of a sudden a massive uptick in public sector and government interest in this space. And particularly this year, maybe people have more time to look at research technologies this year for obvious reasons. But you know, UK government, the Baltic states governments, Nordics, Benelux, they're all looking at this kind of tech right now. And I think that's a combination of the time being right, the technology maturing, and just the groundswell being there, that this is now an obvious thing that is needed, and that the time is right. You know, the time is here for it to happen. And I see repeated evidence of that right now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think regulatory push is going to make a huge difference on adoption. Just sort of actually echoing back to what David was saying, I actually agree with him. It isn't necessarily the technology that's going to lead the change in charge. It's really a point of trust. And I think it's also one step back from that, which is education. It's that educating the need for having digital identity itself, first of all, is important. Secondly, I think what's going to accelerate adoption and implementation is large third-party commercial implementation. And you have your largest leaders in the world. You know, Apple just reached a $2 trillion market valuation. You've got Microsoft, who's introduced, you know, the ION network for identity management. And having the leading technology companies in the world introducing the need for digital identification and digital verification, and moving and migrating to solutions that push that in, and those that prophesize the need for it at commercial level. You know, everyone from Cisco all the way across to, you know, every ERP platform, implementing and driving and pushing the same message and getting it unified across, you know, a third-party commercial marketplace, I think is what's going to accelerate adoption. I think regulatory is going to stay behind what's going on in the industry. They're already behind. They'll stay behind. I mean, listen, they're still discussing, trying to even understand what decentralization means. So they're years out before we're going to see any sort of productive, useful, integrated, contemporaneous regulation that really makes sense, that isn't outdated by the time it's published. I think it's going to come from the larger commercial players in the world that lead today, the top 10. And if there was some sort of level of community of digital identity between all of them together, commercially agreeing upon what those standards should be, putting those standards out, and then adhering to those and implementing them, I think is what's going to lead the charge.
Yeah, definitely. We do agree that many different stakeholders should come together for the, let's say, greater good of digital identity. So now for our last question, we know that well after this COVID pandemic, many aspects of our life have been or are being transformed into digital. So after this, how do you believe that a verified identity will be used in the professional and business world, like more common than what it is today?
I'm going to throw a quick answer on that and let the other gentleman add theirs. There's a very specific initiative that we're designing and building right now, which has to do with distance learning and education. And I think it's very important today to protect the identity and the access to minors and our children. And I think one key element of this that's very important is being able to provide such a system for all distance learning that happens in school systems. We're working on a current initiative with that right now. And I think introducing the use of a DID or process of technology that allows for protection of identity of students in distance learning is super and hypercritical today. And not allowing that access ever to be violated by those that shouldn't have access to children during the distance learning process, the engagement with their teachers, accessing assignments and content online. I have a 10-year-old, and I can assure you that there is absolutely beyond just the typical login, username, and password. I'm concerned at the amount of thousands of students in the school system, just in our region here in the greater New York area, that I have no idea how secure those systems are, where my student information is going, and if my daughter's information is accessible or not, because I put that into a school system, and now that they're not attending a physical school site and going into the classroom and getting that level of protection in the school, it's distant. And so that interactivity of her face, her live learning, her name, who she is, and age, and all this stuff, and then her access to what she has in her device that can be violated is a concern. So I think putting in that digital identity process and what we're doing today has to be a core focus where the most vulnerable exist, which is finance, minors, and things along that line. And I think this is a key element in what needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a really good point. And I think there's others too. I think there are a lot of paper-based processes out there which are very archaic and maybe nearly a century old, which are just ripe for this technology. Things like a lost passport process. You know, in virtually every country that I know of in Europe, that's a paper-based process where you go to an embassy, you sign a form, and that triggers a long, expensive, horrible process, which results in you receiving a piece of paper in your hand as a temporary passport. And you know, we need something 21st century, and there are many processes like that we can revolutionize with tech like this. And yeah, it's very needed.
Definitely.
Yes, I would certainly echo what was said. You know, again, COVID, we had an expression when I worked in government around never wasting a good crisis. And COVID has certainly put to the forefront the need for the ability to do remote identity verification. Again, you know, the demand that we're seeing is predominantly around, you know, areas which are related to what we talked about. So obviously the NHS, we're a provider into the NHS around identity solutions, and they have a need. The universities have a need as you know, resources are made available through digital channels, and actually the link between the two, between, you know, education through into employment in the health sector, there's clearly a demand there. So I think we can in a crisis, it's important to create new trust relationships between organisations, and we can see signs of that happening. So you know, it's a positive outcome from what is a difficult moment.
Okay, thank you so much, Jason, Andrew, and David. Unfortunately, our time is up, but it was very, very nice to have you here. Thank you for accepting our invite. And we really hope that you and our audience watching this have had very good insights from the conversation. And we really hope to keep in touch with all of you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. It's good to meet everybody. Thank you.
Very nice to meet you all.
Okay.